The girl in the basement. The part of our conversation during Jeanette's trip to meet with me for the toll, we were like 7 hours in. We were tired, and it was late. I purposely left this part for the end. I watched her face as she spoke. Jeanette is such a beautiful woman, vibrant, competent, and simply a lovely person. During this part, her eyebrows lowered. Her eyes no longer wide, but slits. The lines in her face deepened. I would look at her as she talked about enduring her dad's abuse. The girl in the basement. Her face changed. She was back there. 5. She was right back there. And I knew in that moment she was telling the truth. The girl in the basement. Once the thought seeps in, it's hard to let it go. These are not my dreams, my experiences. Yet after listening to Jeanette explain the sights, the smells, the terror that ensued for 30 years, I have to be honest. I think about it a lot. Every day, a lot. I've done my own searches. The 70s, right? It's so long ago. And if she was real, she could have come from anywhere, really. It's a web search rabbit hole that can consume an entire day, week, month, year, and decades, if you're Jeanette Robbins. I commented on how far Jeanette has gone, the lengths she's gone to try and find answers. A message I received from her: this is not a joke that these things disturbed me deeply for decades. It's part of my life, whatever it is. Previously on The Toll. Poison. Control.
We lived in a burnt-down house. The top floor had burned.
Yes, it's true. We did not have hot water in our house for 2 years.
And so she was always speculating whether there was some foul play from either her dad or her mom that may have killed someone.
They started having deeper financial issues, and the church would come and bring food.
I didn't know what to do, and I didn't know how to get Danny to stop being the way he was being.
I'm an award-winning journalist who has spent decades chasing stories and investigating cases across the Ozarks. It's tragic, really.
I don't believe in coincidence.
We all have a story.
Nobody was able to make it because everybody was sick.
A dark secret wrapped in emptiness and regret.
Within a year, her entire nuclear family died.
You know.
Tons and tons of chemicals.
The Toll. I'm Nancy Simpson. In 1987, 6 weeks before Jeanette's graduation, Dennis announced the family was moving to Ottumwa, Iowa. Jeanette says her sister Chris needed help and emotional support to make an adjustment to a new school, so Jeanette decided it was best if she moved with the family so she could make sure Chris had a foundation and friends. When I learned Jeanette graduated high school from Ottumwa, I was so confused, and this is why. 6 weeks before graduation. Jeanette says their time in Ottumwa was terrible. The place was rough. In an email with her brother, Will, he says he hated Ottumwa. He wrote that place was scary as hell and that he always was hearing about serial killers and drug dealers next door. And at school, he says there were crazy fights and that all of his friends had super abusive parents who were on drugs. There was a guy who attacked a woman with a knife and a 16-year-old with a fire poker. He was convicted, I see that. His nickname was the North Court Slasher. Jeanette's parents lived on North Court Street at the time. That's why it stood out to her. Jeanette says one of Denise's teenage friends was attacked a few doors down when they lived on Green Street. It really stuck out in her mind. I did not find where the North Court Slasher had a 14-year-old victim. Must have been something different. 1987, Jeanette gets accepted into Brigham Young University in Utah. Her friends tell me that she was like a kid in a candy store. So happy to discover a new way of life. So smart, taking all the hard classes. Thriving. Fall 1988, Chris, her sister, moved there for college. Jeanette says her sister had a hard time adjusting because of past trauma and realized she had left her journals at home. Jeanette says Chris was afraid her dad would read them, inconsolable. Jeanette says she told their mom Chris couldn't stop shaking and was worried about her. Chris felt betrayed from that conversation, and Jeanette says a wall started to form around their relationship. When Jeanette moved out at 18, she says her mom had taken credit out in her name. Later, she says she found out her mom had opened utilities in her name when she was younger, too, unpaid, and ruined her credit. It was a mess, Jeanette says she discovered years later when she went to buy a house. Jeanette again finds herself in the mom role as her siblings move out to Utah one by one for college. Dennis and Jeanne, the parents, they moved to Utah in 1989 to be close to the girls. Dennis's parents ended up moving to American Fork, Utah, and lived down the street from Dennis and Jeanne. The grandpa tells Dennis that Jeanne is stealing from him, from Dennis, her husband, and the grandparents, they left. This was the end of their relationship for quite a while. I did find in one of Jeanne's writings that her mother-in-law, Jo, went into the hospital, quote, she was in bad shape and hallucinating. This was 2 weeks after the fight over money. They didn't talk again until 4.5 years later. In his journal, Dennis indicates he's starting to not feel well. May 1989. Dennis says he's feeling sad, like he's going to die, a strong impression that he'll be leaving, and says he's applied for a $500,000 life insurance policy. He writes notes to Jeanne, calls Chris, Jeanette's younger sister, a snothead, and says he'll make up with her on the other side of the veil. It's a term familiar with Mormons, how everything will be revealed with the Heavenly Father on the other side. He leaves a nice note for young Will, his son. Similar entry for August 1989. He says he's back to feeling like he's going to die. He's giving instructions to Jeanne, like to take care of his parents, giving her money advice. Quote, if I've offended you in any way, I sincerely apologize, he writes. He wishes her happiness if she remarries, but reminds her that they have a pact for eternity. He's had another pain in his chest. He went home, laid down, and felt better. Jeanette.
And yes, he did have chest pains, but it was about 2.5 years before he died, so he went and got a physical. And they gave him a clean bill of health, and he got a large life insurance policy on himself. So he was given a clean bill of health at the time.
In his journal, August 1989, Dennis says he's been having problems with his health.
About that same time he had the chest pains, then 2 weeks or 3 weeks later in his journal, he wrote that he had been diagnosed with food allergies, and that seemed to be the root of his problems. So I believe that's why he thought he was throwing up a lot.
You name it, I'm not supposed to have it, he wrote in his journal. Jeanette says he didn't talk about being sick to the kids.
No, not specifically to me. He just never talked about physical ailments much to any of us. But I talked with my sister about it. And when I called her and said, can you remind me about these food allergies? She said, well, he was just throwing up after everything. Even after chocolate no-bake cookies or ice cream or anything he ate there at the end, he would just throw up.
Was that any red flags to her?
No, I think people tried to leave him alone as much as possible because sometimes he was a little cantankerous.
Jeanne writes in an email that Dennis didn't really complain about his stomach. Quote, it didn't hurt. She says he had constant bowel movements and suddenly became allergic to very unusual things. She writes that Dennis wasn't allergic to wheat, but he was to barley, so no to most breads. Not allergic to milk, but allergic to certain cheeses. Allergic to tomatoes, so no ketchup or spaghetti sauce. Allergic to lettuce, so he couldn't eat a salad. Eating on the road, she said, was hard. She goes on to say Dennis was diagnosed with food allergies about 2 years before he died, so he'd gotten pretty lax about his diet and was paying for it. quote, that could have been the cause of his mysterious abdominal protrusion. I hadn't thought about that until now. Jeanette says Denise painted a different picture, that their dad couldn't stop throwing up. Jeanette says she kept pressing, couldn't shake her mom's words in an earlier conversation. She says Jeanne said Dennis was in the know that he was going to die, laughing as she said, "Believe me, that man knows what happened," and adding, "Well, some would say I had a hand in it anyway." Later, Jeanette asks her mom again about her dad's food allergies. It's that phone call she recorded, asked for by the private investigator.
Well, I know he covered up what probably was heart attack, because I found in his journal that he had such terrible pain in his chest on at least 2 occasions. One when he was working up in Idaho and we were still on American Fork, and he was driving back and had such hideous pain in his chest that he had to pull off the road and stop, and he thought he was going to die right then. And that was about around 2 years before he actually did. And his food allergies were only later on in life, and that was that he just wasn't feeling very well. And so finally he went to an allergist, and they discovered that he was allergic to practically everything, but that his food allergies were not common. They weren't things like milk or wheat, which most people are allergic to, but he was allergic to stuff like cabbage and
Tomatoes.
Yeah, tomatoes and things that other people are not allergic to. I'm not sure whether he was really that violently allergic to it or not. He was having stomach troubles. He was on the road a lot. He was eating most of his meals away. And I really tried very hard to feed him appropriately at home, but he didn't eat appropriately away. And so that's all there is to that.
Chris, Jeanette's sister, is getting married, November 1989. It's a young man Jeanette dated for 3 years. In Dennis's journal, he's hard on Chris the most. I've said that before. Lacks confidence kind of comments. But here, in this part, it's particularly cruel. Before her wedding, she comes to the house and doesn't acknowledge him. Says she has misplaced aggression toward him. In part, he writes, "Forget affection." She never shows that, but she's always mentally cruel, as though I'm some kind of villain who did terrible things to her as a child. She's caused so much contention in the family. Would purposely cause the other girls, especially Denise, to think badly toward me too. Apparently, the last time Chris was hypnotized, so maybe the psychiatrist can tell us more when we call tomorrow morning. So it appears she was getting professional help, and her parents were getting to hear about the sessions? He goes on, "I've tried my best. My conscience is clear." Jeanette says, being hypnotized. That was a thing when she was younger. Grade school. Cameron, Missouri. After whatever happened in Holt Summit, Jeanette says her dad would put a ring on a string and move it back and forth in front of her and Chris. He would talk about the importance of relaxing. He'd say Chris was easy to hypnotize, but Jeanette was tough because she was strong-minded. He had books on it. Jeanette says she knows now he was trying to see what they remembered, wondering what was locked away. Another memory from Cameron. Jeanette wrote to me, "I woke up in Cameron one time crying out to my parents that I couldn't move. Any small movement caused me a lot of pain in my lower pelvis abdomen area. My mom wanted to take me to the hospital immediately, and my dad got very mad and said to just stay in bed. I'd feel better soon. I told my mom about that later, and she remembered that moment too. And she said she remembered it felt strange at the time that he didn't want me to go to the doctors. Now, I don't know what to think about that whole thing. In an email exchange between Jeanne and Jeanette, her mom writes, "Above all, he was afraid that you would talk about him behind his back and say bad things about him. He wanted to be loved, even if he had to force you to love him." September 1989, Jeanette and Jeanne take a trip to Missouri to visit Jeanne's parents in LaBelle before Jeanette goes on her church mission 2 months later. Jeanette says her mom begged her for money when her student loans would come in, money she never got back. Jeanette says her mom sold her car while she was on a mission and kept the money, cashed Chris's checks and lied about it, took stashed cash that Denise got from her fast food job. Jeanette has story after story of her mom taking their money. Jeanette says it was a big source of frustration in the family. When asked directly in an email if Jeanne took the kids' money, she answered, "No, absolutely." All caps, no punctuation. Wouldn't you answer absolutely not? No, absolutely. It just stuck out to me as weird. It was a weird answer. Jeanette going on her Mormon mission, that care package from Mom, so sick she was shipped back home. That goes here. Jeanette says their money problems with their mom likely didn't hit on their dad's radar since the girls avoided him as much as possible. It was all frustrating. Jeanette says while applying to Brigham Young, she didn't qualify for a Pell Grant, college money for poor families. All of her friends got the loan, which included parents who had their PhDs. 3 of them. But Jeanette's parents made too much money. As young adults hanging out with siblings, Jeanette says the topic would often come up. What do you think our parents were doing with their money? In an email years later, Jeanne denies taking money from the kids. In 2014, though, she writes that she has a lot of shame over the family's time in Spring Lake, not staying within budget and quick to blame each other. She wrote, "As we failed to communicate any kind of bad financial news to the other out of love, it resulted in such stupid acts as me taking the money from you and Chris's savings accounts to pay for a water and electric bill so that it would not be shut off, and using Will's money for the same thing, and later your loan money for rent. I convinced myself all those things would be paid back before anyone, especially your dad, found out. But alas, it never happened that way, and I got migraines." Christmas, 1991. Jeanette says, looking back, there's a story about family pictures that stands out, a pattern I've pointed out before.
I was in college. I had gotten a new job as a waitress again. The conditions were that I would have to work through the holidays. And so down in Provo, there's a lot of people with their hands in the air to get these waitressing jobs. I managed to get a job 2 blocks away from where I live so I could just jog to work, make some money, and then go to school. So it was ideal. And my mother had called up and she said, "You must come home for Christmas." And I said, "I just got a job. I've got to pay for things and I need to work through the holidays." She called a 3rd time and she said, "I don't know what my rights are as a mother, but I am ordering you to come home for Christmas. You need to quit that job. We will give you whatever money it is that you need that you would have made. But this could be the last Christmas that we're all together and you must come home." And it was. It was the last Christmas we were together because he died 6 months later in July.
She's talking about her dad, Dennis. Later, after the private investigator asked her to tape a phone call with her mother, Jeanette asked her about this.
And then you said, "No, you have to come home." And then you're saying, "This could be the last Christmas we're all together. Jeanette, this is very important. You have to come home." So then I said, I always do what you guys ask, but this time you guys don't have enough money. I have got to work. So I actually said no for once in my life. And then you called back and you were really upset and you said, "You know what, as your mother, I don't know what rights I have here. I don't know what I can do, but I am going to forbid you from taking this job, and I'm going to insist that you come home because I will send you some money or something, but you have to come home because this could be the last Christmas we ever have together." And then it was the last Christmas. And that kind of freaked me out.
Jeanne says this was a misunderstanding.
Yes, and I said that it might be the last time that we were together because I was thinking of your grandma and grandpa. But that's where we were. That's where we were that Christmas.
Jeanette says her grandparents were in their 60s, healthy at the time. Grandpa Howard, Jeanne's dad, set up his camera equipment and was the one who took the pictures. He had a setup at his house in LaBelle, complete with a black room full of harsh chemicals. Jeanette says after the visit, Grandpa Howard suffered a neurological attack. Doctors were baffled. It was July 1992.
I used to just 100% believe her all the time. And by the time that conversation had come up, I was starting to realize that that was not a good idea to believe it. So I was thinking, well, she said it was about the grandparents, and then Grandpa did get really sick right then. So it made me start wondering, why did Grandpa go into a coma right then? I don't know.
During this time, Jeanette says she helped her parents move to Idaho Falls. May 1992, the girls are young women, 23, 22, and 18. In his journal, Dennis describes him as still a pain, selfish, and disloyal. His goal, he writes, is to run a marathon at 50. He's getting ready to turn 47. He's working out off and on, jogging off and on. They had bought a brand new car. He had a large life insurance policy, and soon, Jeanette says, her parents had again stopped paying rent. Still May 1992. A young man attacked Jeanette on campus. Her dad drove to BYU from Idaho Falls, Idaho, to confront this man. Banged on his door and said he was a police officer, something he got in trouble for. We sent a Freedom of Information request for the official report on the attack, and it confirms Dennis did this. Jeanette says her dad had a court date for impersonating an officer, but he died before that came around. Dennis was 5'8". He confronted this young man who was 6'1" and athletic. Jeanette told her dad she was able to talk her way out of the attack. In the end, Dennis screamed at Jeanette. He changed his mind, saying Jeanette had no voice, no consequence in this young man's decisions, that he did what he wanted and that Jeanette had nothing to do with it. That the young man simply changed his mind. Jeanette says her boyfriend later came out of the other room with Dennis, red-faced, splotchy, and says, "Your dad's a weird duck, Jeanette." He refused to tell her what he said. The attack changed the course of Jeanette's college life. The real police got involved and the attacker ended up in jail. I read through the report and it's scary. Jeanette didn't go back to campus. She went to live with a couple in Utah because it was all so scary. She took her last 16 credits through independent studies so she could graduate. A few weeks before Dennis's death, Jeanette witnessed something strange. All the kids thought it was strange.
Growing up as the oldest child, I observed that they never once told each other that they loved each other. I never saw them hold hands in all those years, or even a kiss on the cheek. They were very non-affectionate. I was home for May and June. He died in July. I was home for about 4 weeks. They kept going outside and going on walks in the evening in Idaho Falls. And they would leave and they were holding hands and they'd come back holding hands in these deep conversations. We were looking at each other and I remember saying, "What's up with the parents?" And nobody knew. It was a very big change of behavior.
In the chat with the private investigator years later, Jeanne, the mom, says the walks included instructions for when after Dennis died.
I was working at a radio station again, but I had been working. I was more working for pleasure than I was for income.
Uh-huh.
So we were good in terms of finances. We were going to garage sales on Saturday mornings together as just a hobby. We were taking walks together. He seemed to have a real premonition of dying. he'd been talking to me about it, telling me things to do, when he died. What to do with the house, or what to do with this, and what to do with, the kids. And, I didn't want to hear that sort of thing, but, it was just something.
Jeanette says the weapons in the house growing up weren't unusual, but toward the end, her dad ramped it up a notch. Super paranoid. A few months before he died, she was taking a trip to Oklahoma.
He stopped us, he said a prayer with us, and he said, if a terrorist tries to get you guys, this is what you have to do. And he went on and on about it. He scribbled a note, he put it on the dashboard. He said, if you take this note off the dashboard, I'll find out about it. I'll know you did it. And it was instructions on how to deal with the terrorist. And my brother, in fact, we got right down the street, he ripped the terrorist note off the front of the car, rolled it in a ball and threw it out the window, and I go, oh my gosh, we're going to get killed. And he said, I don't care, I'm sick of this crap.
But she says it didn't stop.
And then at the very end, he had a throwing knife taped under the table, and he had a gun he had a baseball bat behind the door, a gun in the bathroom, just things I kept finding. And I remember saying to him, do you even know how to use this throwing knife? Is this in case someone tries to get us at dinner? And he got upset with me for making that joke. But I didn't know what was going on. It was very odd.
I'm telling you these stories because I think they're important. If Dennis was ingesting something harmful, this may be the result. Looking more crazy than usual, jumbled, like Roy, husband number 2, agitated, paranoid, like Bruce, husband number 3. Jeanette says her dad could be intimidating at home, forceful, but right before his death, everything ramped up. July 1992. They get a call that Jeannie's father isn't doing well. He had some kind of neurological attack earlier, and doctors were having a hard time figuring out what was wrong with him. But now, it looked as though the end was near. Jeanette says her parents had no money.
And in fact, they had to borrow money from my uncle for the gas to get out to Missouri for my grandfather's illness that was going on at the time.
Jeannie, in an interview with a private detective years later, talks about this experience.
Dennis and I and Denise, we picked her up from college and we drove to Missouri. Drove all one night. He said, I need to give your dad a blessing. I need to go out there and see if your mom will let me give your dad a blessing. Could I give him a blessing? And so we looked up another member of the church. And in the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to live. And that was the entire blessing. And I was just like, that was not the blessing that I wanted my dad to have. He was on all sorts of life support. The doctors had said that he was not going to live. He had a virus of some sort. They didn't know what.
Here's Jeanette.
My father gave my grandfather a blessing, and he called someone else in from the church, and he said, I command you to live. And 3 days later, my grandfather was reading the newspaper and out of a coma, and they were planning on pulling the plug that Friday, and my father was having his funeral instead. It was something else. She called and said, Jeanette, I have some bad news. And I said, oh my gosh, it's Grandpa. And she said, no, it's your father. He died this morning. I actually fell to the ground, and the phone was beside me. I said, what? And she said, bring clothes for 2 funerals because they're going to take your grandfather off the machines on Friday. Bring something for a Mormon funeral and a non-Mormon funeral because they're both dying. They're both dead, basically.
So Dennis and Jeannie Spriggs are in Missouri. Jeannie's father, Lewis Howard, is coming out of a coma after being taken off life support, and Dennis is about to die. It's July 1992. Jeannie says Dennis was having pain in his arm on his trip to Missouri. Can't prove that to be true other than Jeannie saying this. Years earlier, he had been writing about those chest pains in his journal. I saw those entries. Their oldest daughter, Jeanette Robbins, was talking about this, if you'll remember.
And yes, he did have chest pains, but it was about 2.5 years before he died, so he went and got a physical. And they gave him a clean bill of health, and he got a large life insurance policy on himself. So he was given a clean bill of health at the time.
Dennis was suffering from what doctors tagged late-onset food allergies. Here's Jeannie with the private investigator. She's talking about the night before Dennis died.
And we all sat down to supper that night, and then he had a lot of food allergies. Two of the things that he was very allergic to was any kind of tomato paste, tomato sauce, tomato paste, and cheese, and or milk products. And my mom had made lasagna for supper that night, and he loved lasagna, but stayed away from it most of the time. And he sat down, and everyone at supper just commented on the fact, not really knowing too much about the fact that he had these food allergies, but commented on the fact that he just ate like 5 helpings of lasagna and just kept eating and eating and eating lasagna. And, I probably shouldn't be eating all of this. And, I know, but it's just so good, and it just tastes so good. And I thought, if anything, he was going to, have quite a little bit of indigestion.
In an email to Jeanette, she says Dennis had 3 huge helpings of Mom's lasagna. Does it matter? These little inconsistencies? I don't know. Misremembering? Exaggerations? I just want to point them out. I also want to reiterate that I don't know if Jeannie really hurt or killed anyone. I'm telling this story through the eyes of Jeanette with the help of people I've interviewed and documentation that's been collected. It's about the toll. Here's Jeannie's version of the morning Dennis died. In her words.
He got up the next morning about a little before 7, and we had all stayed up late that night and visited. And the next morning he got up a little before 7 and said, I love you, which we didn't normally say verbal things like that. And then he said he was going to go jogging, and he had the night before he had sat down with my son-in-law and had mapped and had decided that he was going to go on this 10-mile jog, this 10-mile run. And he had started jogging again not all that long before, and he was kind of a fanatic about, if he was going to start exercising, why he didn't start exercising gradually. He'd do it all of a sudden,
I want to point out here that this conversation with this private investigator, Mark Nozak, he hardly asks her any questions. She just offers up all kinds of information, one topic bleeding into another. She goes on and on for about an hour. He basically says, tell me about yourself. And for the next 55 minutes, she just talks. Was she nervous? I'd be nervous if I was being investigated by the FBI and a private investigator showed up at my door, unannounced.
Hi, Mrs. Fulford. How are you?
Yes, ma'am. Excuse me.
Did I catch you in the middle of lunch?
You caught me eating, and I had a piece of...
I apologize.
No, I think it's a piece of Taco Bell wrapper. In my mouth. Let me just flip this out in the yard.
Flip it out.
All right.
My name is Mark Nosak. I'm a private detective.
Yes.
And I've been investigating you for the last year and a half.
Yes, okay.
Are you aware about that? That's who I am.
Okay, fine.
Would you mind taking a few minutes and talking with me?
I'd be happy to.
By the way, here's your newspaper, and you got a package.
Okay, thank you. Some of my children and some of Bruce's children and grandchildren.
Big family.
Yes, a lovely family.
Good. Sweet. Where do you want to talk?
Well, why don't you come on in?
Okie doke. I didn't catch you in the middle of something, did I?
Taco Bell.
Taco Bell. I apologize.
No problem. I've been cleaning up from Halloween. Have a seat. Just there on the couch. It'll be fine.
Okay, thank you.
Or was she trying to answer all the questions she thought he'd ask? She seemed in control of the visit. At least so far. Jeanette, their oldest daughter, wasn't there when her dad died, if you'll remember. She was in Utah. As I read through his journal, Dennis is exercising a lot. Not every day, not every week, but certainly, in the scheme of things, a lot. Work, kids, scripture, and exercise. It's really all he talks about. Sure, some weeks he'd slack off, some months he'd slack off, but in his journal, he by no means was a couch potato. He pushed himself, and he pushed his children to get moving. Jeanette says she lived this.
He had a goal to run a marathon when he was 50, and so he was working hard towards that goal. It's not like he went out for the first time in his life and went for a jog. He was jogging here and there always throughout his life. And so that morning when he went out for a jog, it was really no different than any other day.
In an email years later, as Jeanette worked to get more information out of her mother, Jeanne says Dennis had chest pains and had gotten $1 million life insurance policy after his first incident. She says they canceled it because they couldn't afford it. The other time, he went to the doctor, checked out fine except for the sudden food allergies. She says shortly before he died, he started giving her instructions about what to do in the event that something happened to him. From Jeanne's email, I should have been paying attention more, I guess, to how he'd been feeling. He would work way too hard for 3 days and then he'd be totally exhausted and in bed for 4. But that was a pattern that he went through off and on his whole life, so I didn't notice that much. His face would get really red sometimes and I worried about his blood pressure. But when we would check it at the grocery store or pharmacy, it was always normal. Jeanne says Dennis had just started back running and lifting weights a week or so before they made the trip to Missouri. This is, again, from Jeanne's writings, from 2013. He laid out a 10-mile course and talked about it to Willie Heinrich, his son-in-law, although he didn't tell him where he was going. I had no idea that he was intending to run that far. That morning, when he left at 6:30, it was already so hot and so humid that Mom and I were sitting out on the porch trying to cool off. We both tried to talk him out of going. He just smiled and waved. Now here's Jeanne telling that story to the private investigator.
So he just started and left home, and it was so humid that my mom and I at 7 o'clock in the morning sat out on the porch because we couldn't even hardly stand it inside. They didn't have air conditioning, and he said, gosh, he says, I don't think I really want to do this, but that's something I have to do. And I said, I really don't think you have to do this. And he says, yes, I do. Well, bye. And so he took off.
She says there that he left at 7. In her email, she says 6:30. Same thing? Close enough? Jeanette says as she arrived in LaBelle to be with the family, her mother told her Dennis went out for a jog before anyone got up. At 5 that morning. There was a curtain for a door to the bedroom by the kitchen. When I went to LaBelle with Jeanette, we were able to make our way into the grandparents' house. The new owners still have a curtain for a door. It's a modest house. I walked it off.
Can I step this out? Just stand right there, then step it.
It's just, there is no recreation. That was the spot. We get that spot.
15 steps.
Oh my gosh, thank you. I feel like I just got a nice big hug from the Howards. I really appreciate it. Sorry for intruding.
Yes, thank you so much. The dark room?
Oh, can we just, is it okay if we glance at the dark room?
13 steps from the bedroom curtain used as a door to the kitchen sink. Short trip. Mike, the owner of the house now, declined letting us into that back room. It's used for storage now. Here's Jeanette talking about the stories surrounding her dad the morning he died.
That he had woken up very early in the morning. Originally, I believe I was told 5 a.m., and that she heard him at the sink getting a drink of water, and then he left on a jog. A couple years later, the story was that he was out on the porch talking to my grandmother and my mother and said, I sure don't want to do this. And then he left, like around 8.
Then years later, this different story emerges. Why? That whole, I don't want to go, I love you. Jeanette says she believes that never happened.
I don't believe anyone talked to him that morning. I believe that was a story added later. The day before, he sat down with maps with some of the family members to say, I think I'm going to go jog here and here. And he plotted out his path. And then the next morning got up and took off for his jog.
The map, plotting his route. Jeanette says her dad had never done that before. Jeanne, talking to the private investigator, says there were distractions that morning, and then there's a point where everyone started to worry.
So it was a couple of hours before anybody actually really thought too much about the fact that he hadn't come back. And I said, he really should be back by now. And maybe he's gotten, maybe he got hurt or something like that, or maybe he sprained his ankle or...
She describes LaBelle, Missouri, where Dennis was jogging that morning.
There's trees everywhere, and so you can't see any place. And the gravel roads go this way, and there's no straight road. And so we had no idea where he could possibly have gone. And so a couple of people went out in cars to see where he went. We knew which direction he took off from the house, but from there he could have gone anywhere. And so a couple of people took off in cars and went looking. And I got in a car and went looking. And and we searched, and then I said, well, I'll stay here by the phone, and then somebody else went looking, and by about 11, we decided we'd better call the sheriff. And the sheriff was in Monticello, which is 15 miles away. And so by the time he got there, it was around 11:30. And he went down to the coffee shop and got some guys from the search party, and they formed a search party. And it was about 1:30 before he came back to the house to tell me that they had found him.
She says the sheriff arrived at the house to deliver the news.
And he said he wasn't hit by a car. He said from the looks of things, he said the weeds weren't disturbed or anything, and he said it looked as though he just died instantly. I said probably from a heart attack. He says the coroner's on vacation and won't be back for a couple of weeks. He said, if you want me to, he said, I can call around to a couple of the other counties around here and see if I can find somebody to do an autopsy. And I said, well, I'd just as soon not have him cut up if it's not necessary. And that's how come there was never an autopsy done.
Jeanette says her mom's version to her was a little more dramatic and specific.
She said she put her hands in the air and waved them and said, no autopsy, no autopsy. He had heart problems. And they said, don't worry, Jeannie. This town was population 700 and she grew up there. She said, I just waved my hands and said, no autopsy, no autopsy. Later, they said it was because they had no reason to believe anything was wrong and they'd known the family their whole lives.
Dennis's body was found just yards away from a cemetery. Jeanette says more questions came about after she received the coroner's report years later. Cardiac arrest, heart attack, those words were not listed like Jeanne had said.
It said heat stroke due to jogging. And so I was surprised to see that because she had always said heart attack. I was also surprised to see heat stroke due to jogging when the original story was that he left at 5 a.m. We all were joggers and exercised a lot, and his big rule was you don't ever go out in the heat. You always get up early and exercise. So for him to go down like that seemed very anti-him, I guess you'd say.
We requested another copy of Dennis's death certificate to see if it had been changed to include anything new after the FBI exhumation, and it had not. We'll go over what's in it a little later. Jeanne says she went out looking for Dennis. Jeanette says her mom told her she stayed at the grandparents' house, by the phone. Remember, Jeanne's dad is in critical condition. In an email, Jeanette challenges her mom on these differing stories. Jeanne pushes Jeanette to a chapter in her history papers. It's the installment called Cherish. This is an excerpt from Cherish, written 1 month before the U.S. attorney said that there'd be no charges. Willie Heinrich, that is Chris's husband, Jeanette's sister, Willie Heinrich drove one car and Chris and I took off in another to look for Denny. The night before, Denny had mapped out a 10-mile course that he planned to run and showed it to Willie, but he had not been jogging for quite some time and little country roads go in all directions from LaBelle. The distance between occupied houses is sometimes miles, and the opportunity to get lost is also very real. So we drove around, asked people, checked back at the house frequently, and found nothing. I didn't want to search long. Something inside me didn't want to find him, because I feared the worst. Finally, at 11 o'clock, I called the county sheriff's office 20 miles away. The sheriff came and questioned me, and about 11:30 went to the coffee shop downtown and got a search party together. The next hours were even more agonizing, but finally, at about 12:30, the sheriff returned. Willie was still out searching. Over the years, I had experienced many nightmares of Denny's death. In each case, it had been a sheriff who had come to the door to tell me that he had died. I had always assumed that since he drove so many miles, that Denny would be killed in an auto accident. But as I saw the sheriff coming up the sidewalk to my parents' house, I realized that it had never been a highway patrolman in my dreams. It had always been a sheriff. They had finally found Denny in a ditch covered by some weeds, where he had apparently fallen after a sudden heart attack. There were no signs except that he had died instantly. Willie had passed there several times, and I had passed there once. Although I knew what news the sheriff was going to tell me, I still nearly passed out when he did. After, as we sat on the porch and talked, nearly the first question he asked me was, "What do you want done with the body?" I was so angry, I almost yelled at him as I said, "I don't even want there to be a body. How should I know?" He told me that the coroner was on vacation and that there was no one else to do an autopsy unless we got someone from another county. He said that he would make those arrangements if I wanted, but he didn't think it was necessary. I didn't either. A couple of days before Dennis died, he went to visit his father, Harold Spriggs. They had been estranged for years after his dad told Dennis that Jeanne had been stealing money from Dennis when they all lived in Utah. The grandparents at that point had moved back to Missouri.
My father pulled my grandfather close and whispered, "You were right about everything." And then my father passed away a couple days later, because that was the trip he was in Missouri. My grandfather, who was a very tough old man, he was a boxer, he was 40 years a prison guard, he was the head of the union. Nobody was going to crack that man. He broke down like a baby at my father's funeral. I rode with him because my mother was fine. My grandfather needed me, and I was in shock. We needed each other. And that's when he told me, he said, "You know, your father told me I was right about everything." And he continued to repeat that story over the next 15 years or so. How long was it? Until he passed away in 2012, I think. He continued to tell me that story.
Did he tell you what he thought that meant?
He did not. He wasn't a big talker. He just said, "You know your mom killed your dad, right?"
And he would say that openly to you?
He said that to everyone. And so what happened was that my mother told everyone that he was crazy, not to talk to Grandpa. And my sister actually got up and stormed out of his house one time and said, "You're crazy. Why would you say that?" So there was a big falling out. And in fact, when my grandfather died in 2012, I believe was the year, I was the only one that had seen him in 15 years. They completely exiled him. They would not talk to him. My brother had come in one time at basically my request, and really it was good for him to see him. But he was the resident crazy person. My mom would tell everyone, "You know, he was paranoid schizophrenic growing up." I looked at all his he held the same job 40 years. A paranoid schizophrenic can't hold a job for 40 years. He was not that person that she depicted, and I loved him very much. So, but I looking back, I believe she wanted to alienate his relationships.
I want to add here Jeanne's last chapter of her autobiography, her history papers, as she calls them, is titled Cherish. I touched on this earlier, but here's a little more detail. This chapter was written in 2010, 4 years after the FBI investigation began. She talks about Harold and his wife, Josephine, Dennis's mom and dad, and how they were giving them $250 a month to get by. Dennis and Jeanne had missed a payment, and a big fight broke out. She said Harold blamed it on Jeanne, saying she was a poor money manager. Then Jeanne writes, Harold called to say Joe was in the hospital. She was in bad shape and hallucinating. She says Harold blamed it on them for not having the money to buy her meds. She eventually got better, and Jeanne says they made sure she was getting her medication delivered to her home. This Cherish chapter is dated July 15th, 2010. The FBI notified all families the U.S. attorney was not going to charge Jeanne on August 14th, 2010. 1 month. So by this date on her writings, does she feel a decision is close and she's trying to tie up loose ends? I don't know. If she has hurt people, these writings could be part of a strategy to explain certain events. Harold Spriggs, Dennis's dad, doesn't die until 2013. What would he tell the FBI? If they were to ask. Back to Dennis's fascination with death. He mentioned it several times in his diary, that not long for this earth type thing. Some believe it was sparked by his brother committing suicide when he was just a kid, but whatever it was apparent this thought consumed him at times. Here's Jeanette.
She said he was always depressed. He wanted to leave us well taken care of. She said he was very unhappy in his life. He was very depressed, and he would never leave this earth without knowing that he had taken care of me, meaning her. So that was her take on it, was that he was going to die and that he planned to leave her well taken care of.
That's not how it was when they left Idaho Falls, though. Jeanette says when they left to visit a dying Grandpa Howard in Missouri and Dennis died, the couple was getting help from the church and rent was overdue. If you'll remember, Jeanne told the private investigator they had money. She was actually working for pleasure, not because they needed it. While Jeanne and Dennis were in Missouri, an eviction notice was being slapped on their door in Idaho.
They'd never bought a new car, but they did. They bought a brand new car, and that was 3 months before he died. And somebody put life insurance on the car while I was at college and then came out to the funeral. One of the cars had already been repossessed back at the house, and that was the brand new car, the Eagle Summit. And I did happen to be home that night when a tow truck came and took off with the car. And then when we were at the funeral, someone was calling looking for their white van, so they would have had no vehicles. And my mother said, thank heavens we put life insurance on the car, because if he had died even one day later, we wouldn't have got the car back. But now I get the whole car back, full and paid off, and it's a brand new car.
Without making a single payment. She says her mom was proud of the fact that she got that car free and clear. Jeanette says so many things lined out for July 1992.
That 2.5-year period when he had his insurance reinstated in his journal, that is when all of their bills went out, and at the very end, that was the bill they paid. I do remember also saying, don't we need to do an autopsy for this life insurance? Because how are they just going to pay you without knowing if he committed suicide or something? And she said, no, it was right at 2 years ago he got the policy. So as long as it was over 2 years, then it doesn't matter how he died. We still get the money.
I'm going to spend a little time on this email thread. It's pages long. The subject line is simply R.E. car. Jeanne talks about it being easier to get a loan on a new car, and it was mandatory to carry credit life insurance on Dennis to get the loan. There was a balloon payment of $1,500 due in June. It's a long email. In a nutshell, she says H&R Block told them they were getting $1,500 back. But oops, she says the Spriggs luck kicked in and the tax service called in April saying they actually owed $1,500. They had a good relationship with the bank, but of all things, she writes, the bank was bought by another bank and there were totally new people, so loans were due on the due date. She says the radio station where she was working changed management, so she was out of work on May 15th, but had a new job by the end of June, but couldn't make the payment and the car was repossessed. Jeanne says she talked to the dealer and told them Dennis was due an $8,000 bonus in mid-July and asked if he could hold the car until then. She says this is where the car was when Denny died. She also adds that leaving the house had nothing to do with non-payment. She writes, we had been verbally promised a lease on the house, and when the landlord backed out, he and Denny got into a fight and he ordered us out. She added later that they were indeed served with a 3-day evict. Quote, there was a little more to the story, but that's it in a nutshell, she said. Her last line in this email thread, so much for another Spriggs car luck story. I reached out to the landlord a couple of times. He did not respond to my request for an interview. Jeanette lived nearly her entire life with her parents in this rat race, so no real red flags at this point. Why would there be? Remember, Jeanette's suspicions build over time. But she says this right here, it really sticks out. Did at the time, too. The part where the parents were going on long walks, holding hands, showing affection.
After my father passed away and we were driving home from Missouri to Idaho Falls, we had a long time to talk in the car. And so she was driving and I was in the passenger side. And between tears, I would start having my mind think on things. And that was one thing I asked her. I said, what were you doing on those walks? What were you talking about? And after asking her 3 or 4 times and pressuring her, then she said, things to do in the event of his death. And then she just looked forward again while she was driving. And she said, in fact, he even presented me with a contract for me to sign saying that I would agree to rig his body in the coffin to sit up when we walked by to scare the hell out of us. At the time, I just always believed her. I don't know if that's true or not, but I do know she told some other people that at the funeral, and they kind of laughed and said, oh, he always was up to a joke or something, trying to make people laugh. I didn't think it was funny. I was traumatized by the idea. He enjoyed scaring us. We'll just leave it at that.
Jeanette ponders on this also.
She lived about 3 blocks from where he was buried in Kirksville, Missouri, when she moved back to Missouri and started a business. And in all that time, she never walked the 2 blocks down to his grave to even put a flower down. And it was as if he just didn't exist. She got rid of his stuff. She didn't talk about him. She moved on. And if we asked questions, she would try to change the subject. And I would keep pushing. And eventually, if I asked enough times, she would turn and give me a little something, and then I hope that's enough of that kind of thing. But no, she didn't need to process or download this death with anyone. It was over. She said, it's like a big dark cloud got lifted off our family, is what she said when we pulled out of LaBelle.
That phrase, Jeanette has written that to me in notes. It's in the 26-page report she wrote to the FBI, and she confronts her mother about it in an email. Jeanette couldn't shake it. Jeanette challenges her mother, writing, I remember Denise leaning over in the car when we were heading home to Idaho after the funeral and saying to me, I hate to say this, but the ride home is going to be a lot better without him. And I remember you, Mom, saying, it's like a big dark cloud got lifted off our family. And also, I'm ready for other trials in my life besides money. You seemed relieved and were even planning a vacation on the way back home. You remember that? Jeanne denies it. She writes, the main thing that I remember about the trip home was the radio playing that song about life is a highway. Sometimes I sang along to try and keep you guys thinking I was okay. Other times, I remember looking out the front window and having tears streaming down my face. I don't remember anything about any of the conversations. Jeanette wrote to me, quote, she never had tears streaming down her face. I was riding shotgun most of the way back or driving myself, and I studied her. I was so confused. I just turned and stared at her a lot. Smiles, relief, plans for the future, never tears. But none of that's a crime, right? We all grieve in our own way. Whatever that looks like. Jeanette says the kids were shocked to learn their dad was making $60,000, saying insurance paid out around 4 times his earnings. Especially back then, that was a lot of money. And they had 2 vehicles being repossessed, an eviction notice on the door. There's an email thread to Jeanette from Will, her brother. He's trying to make sense of their mother. This is nearly 4 years after the FBI investigation. They have a long email thread going, but here's part of it. I'll paraphrase it. He talks about putting people in categories and that's dangerous. He says their mom may have character flaws, but that he can't label her a psychopath. He talks about her being on painkillers for migraines for years, but concludes that didn't mean she was addicted to them or hurt people. And he also expresses that their mom likely married the men for money, but doesn't think she played a role in their deaths. He says he's seen her be a good person and work hard, and admits she made some stupid decisions after their dad died, desperate to not be alone. Will, Jeanette's brother. wrote that email. It's a long email. I'm paraphrasing it. That's a portion of it. A day before Dennis died, I have a picture of him on Jeannie's parents' porch in LaBelle. He's smiling, trying to wrangle 2 of Chris's kids on his lap. He looks fine. Happy. After Dennis died, the girls found something that left them very confused. Unsettled.
Well, this was an odd thing that I remember getting a roll of film from my sister's camera, Denise's camera, after he had died. And she said, wait a minute, I had a whole bunch of pictures left on this film, this camera. And she got it developed, and, we didn't have a lot of money, so it took some money to develop film. And she said, I am so mad, look at this. There's about 10 photos of Dad with the dog waving. And I said, what? And it was all these pictures with our dog Blackie, and he had him in his lap, and they were waving at the camera. And I don't know who took the photos, but it was creepy, like he was waving goodbye, or somebody wanted to take 10 last photos of him waving with the dog. That was something that bothered me. Yeah. That roll of film got developed after he died, and so those pictures were on the end of the roll, and it would have been taken in the last week or 2. She and I were both very freaked out about that. We said, what are these pictures of Dad waving? He didn't even like pictures of himself. Yeah, so someone took pictures of him waving, about 10 pictures with him and the dog. Yeah.
Dennis's body does get exhumed years later, and the private investigator gives Jeanette her father's report from the coroner. Jeannie gets her insurance money, moves back to Kirksville, and buys a house. It's Will's senior year. He graduates from Kirksville and moves to Utah to attend college. That brings us up to Jeannie marrying Roy Forgy, husband number 2, in Ottumwa, Iowa, in 1994. Next time on The Toll. Poison Control.
The doctors had said that he was not going to live.
And she goes, I'm Fruity Yummy Mummy. That's my serial killer name. Get it?
I mean, you did send the candy and there was arsenic in it.
I was wondering, when you guys mentioned that you had carted out tons and tons of chemicals.
Thank you for listening. The Toll Podcast, Season 2, Poison Control, is a production of The Toll, LLC. Creator, investigator, host, and audio producer, me, Nancy Simpson. Executive producer, Pamela Shelby. Original intro and recording by Jay Lashley. Special thanks to Shelby Powers for assisting with web design and original brand identity. Music by Fesleyan Studios. Reproduction or any part of this broadcast without the express permission of The Toll, LLC is prohibited. Get updates at our website, thetollpodcast.com.